And it's chapters 9 through 11 as a section expand the horizons of the book's actions. Up to now, Israel's opposition has come from individual cities. But now, coalitions of cities are opposing them. In this chapter, a coalition of 6 kings from throughout the land will come against the Israelites. In Joshua 10, 5 southern kings band together against them and against them and the Gibeonites. And in chapter 11, a coalition of many northern kings will do the same. Each group convened as a result of their hearing about the exploits of Joshua and his people. Israel's reputation had already spread throughout the land, according to chapter 2, 9 through 11, and chapter 5 and verse 1. The Canaanites had heard about Israel and its victories, and their hearts melted. In contrast, now the Canaanites did not appear to fear the Israelites, even after their impressive victories at Jericho and Ai, because they joined forces to attack Israel. Now, this is a remarkable turnaround in attitude, due, no doubt, to the spectacle of Israel's having been defeated in battle by the men of Ai. The Canaanites' fear of the Israelites was now diminished, and they felt confident in doing battle with the Israelites. Now, not all Canaanites reacted with paralyzed fear, as did the people in Jericho, or with aggressive attacks, as the coalitions in chapter 9, 10, and 11. The Gibeonites heard about the Israelites' successes, and they devised their own strategy of trickery and accommodation with the Israelites, one that allowed them to survive destruction, even though they ended up as the slaves of the Israelites. Their strategy is covered in chapter 9, verses 3 through 27. Now, the nature of the Gibeonites' treaty with Israel has attracted considerable scholarly attention. Many scholars identify elements of an ancient Near Eastern treaty in this section, in which a relationship between a superior party and an inferior party is established. These elements include, number one, the fact that Joshua made peace with the Gibeonites. Number two, the eating of provisions. And number three, the taking of an oath. Now, the treaty evidently included provisions for mutual defense as well, because the Israelites came to the Gibeonites' defense when they were attacked. It also appears to have included provisions for punishment of either party if it violated the terms of the treaty, because David delivered 7 descendants of Saul over to the Gibeonites for punishment when it was pointed out to him that Saul had earlier tried to annihilate the Gibeonites, thereby breaking the treaty. This is found in 2 Samuel chapter 21. The binding nature of this treaty, as evidenced in verse 18 of Joshua chapter 9, forms the basis for the actions taken in chapter 10, where the Gibeonites found themselves threatened by a Canaanite coalition and appealed to the Israelites for help, which they gave. However, as we've already said, the Gibeonites lied to Joshua in order to make this treaty and save themselves from destruction. On the other hand, Joshua and the people enter into the agreement without consulting God. Finally, God allowed them to be deceived and be bound by the treaty as a consequence. Notice that God has been giving the instructions and the strategy for the events thus far. Now it seems that God has stepped back in such a way to test Joshua to see what he will do in this situation. Now, I'm just speculating here, But God does not warn Joshua that the Gibeonites are coming to deceive him. He does not tell Joshua that the Gibeonites are actually residents of Canaan and that he should not listen to them. God allows Joshua to be deceived, I believe, to test him, to see if he has become arrogant or prideful concerning the victories that have been achieved, and to see if he believes that he can make his own decisions now about what to do in any given situation. Maybe I'm off on this point, but then again, maybe I'm not. Whether right or wrong, I believe the lesson for us today is that we should seek God's guidance and his will concerning any major decision in our lives. While I do not believe that we receive messages directly from God any more as Joshua did and others in the Bible, I do believe that God's providential will is still in effect today. He can open doors as well as close them concerning opportunities for his children. It's in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 16, that we find that we should make our plans in life based with the knowledge, or based on the knowledge, that God still works in his providential ways, and that to make plans without considering God's will is simple evil arrogance. James chapter 4, 13 through 16 says this, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Now in chapters 10 and 11, we find the account of Israel's conquest of northern and southern Canaan after it had gained a foothold in central Canaan by defeating Jericho and Ai and making a treaty with the Gibeonites. Several striking parallels can be seen between the two chapters. Both open with accounts of a coalition of kings who opposed Israel's invasion. Both mention God's help in repelling the attacks. Both open with descriptions of decisive battles and are followed by further military activity related to these battles. Each account shows one main instigator of the coalition. In chapter 10, it is Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem. In chapter 11, it is Jabin, king of Hatzor. Each chapter then ends with an account of the consolidation of power in each area. Now, both chapters, that is again chapters 10 and 11, are linked with chapter 9. In that, in all three chapters, coalitions of Canaanite kings came out against Israel because of what they had heard of Israel's successes. The section of chapter 10, verses 1 through 27, tells of the Israelites' victory over a southern coalition of Canaanite kings who attacked Gibeon as a result of that city's threat with Israel. Thus, the account here is a test of the validity of the treaty and Israel's commitment to its oath. The question was, would Israel be true to its word and defend this people with whom it had a binding treaty? The battle took place near Gibeon, but its aftermath unfolded elsewhere, at a cave near Makkedah. The Battle of Gibeon is the last battle described in any detail in the book, since after this the text merely summarizes the campaigns in the south and in the north. In chapter 11 and verse 23, we see one of the statements in the book which shows that God's promises concerning the land were fulfilled. There is no land promise left for the modern-day nation of Israel. Also, we see the promise of rest fulfilled here, at least in some way, in the statement that the land had rest from war. Now we know that there is still some fighting left to do in driving out the remaining inhabitants in certain places. This will be seen later, but the land had been inherited and the major fighting had ended. Now I think one of the lessons that we can learn from these two chapters concerns the events with the Gibeonites. The lesson is that once we give our word that we will do something, we better keep our word, even if it costs us something to do it. To do anything else is to become known as a liar. And Revelation chapter 28 and verse 9 says that all liars will end up in hell. Now we come to chapter 12. This chapter forms an appendix of sorts to the first major section of the book. This chapter summarizes and states again the kings and territories that the Israelites conquered. It is appropriate to have this list here, even if a sense of closure has already been achieved at the end of chapter 11, because of the great importance placed in the book on Israel's inheritance of the land. Now that the major battles were over and the land subjugated for all practical purposes, the author attaches this list, specifying in detail the cities and regions Israel has conquered. Even though the list is primarily a geographical one, it is couched in terms of the kings of the geographical areas. However, the kings' names are not important, so none are recorded except for those of Sihon and Og. The conquest of the land is of paramount importance in the book of Joshua. Now in verses 1 through 6, these look back at the lands Israel had conquered east of the Jordan, reaching back into the book of Numbers to tell of battles and lands conquered before Joshua was Israel's leader. Verses 7 and 8 provide an overview of the lands conquered west of the Jordan. Verse 8 also includes the name of the 6 nations. Then verses 19 through 24 contain a list of 31 kings and their cities that the Israelites conquered in these lands. Now the reason for the inclusion of the area on the other side of the Jordan is that now truly Israel was in process of gaining its long-awaited inheritance. And it is fitting to review all of its gains to this point, whether east or west of the Jordan River. It reinforces the theme of national unity mentioned in chapter 1. The chapter also focuses on the leadership of Moses and Joshua. Now, a moment ago we said that this list is given to us because of the great importance placed in the book on Israel's inheritance of the land. However, we have also said in previous lectures that this is ultimately not about Israel, nor is it ultimately about the land. The accounts in the book generally, and the list here specifically, is ultimately about God. Here, I believe we should highlight and learn from the fact that God is faithful. He has never went back on a promise, and we can be certain of the fact that he never will. It is certain that he will never go back on his promises concerning salvation for those who are faithful. We can take great comfort in that knowledge. However, what some do not like to acknowledge is that while God is faithful concerning his promises of salvation for the faithful, he is going to be just as faithful concerning his promises of punishment for the disobedient, the unrepentant, or the unfaithful person. We do not like to talk about the wrath of God, but it is a fact, and it is a promise that he will definitely keep, just as with all of his other promises. In Colossians chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, it says, "Therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. For it is because of these things that the wrath of God will come upon the sons of disobedience." Now we come to the last major section of the book. This is chapters 13 through 21, and it is a section about the apportioning of the land. Now, these chapters stand as a very real counterpart to chapters 6 through 12. And together, these two sections form the heart of the book of Joshua. Whereas chapters 6 through 12 tell of the taking of the land, chapters 13 through 21 tell of the distribution of the land. Once the land had been taken and its peoples defeated, then it remains to clarify which groups in Israel would receive which territories. These chapters are lengthy and detailed, and considered as a whole, they form a massive center of gravity for the book. The very massiveness of this material indicates its importance. God's promise of the land to Abraham was an important part of the covenant with him and his descendants. And so much of the Pentateuch consistently points toward Israel's inheritance of the land and gives instructions for how to live in it. It therefore should not surprise us that when the time finally arrives that Israel entered into possession of the land, the book of Joshua lingers over and savors, so to speak, this wonderful fulfillment. Israel's possession of the land is looked at from several perspectives in the book of Joshua, including the military encounters that made it possible in the first place, as well as the detailed legal descriptions of the borders and cities in the land. These chapters show us that Yahweh was a promise-keeping God, as we have already noted. In general, the detailed listings fulfill his land promises to give the land that he had repeated so many times previously. More specifically, chapter 13 reviews the lands that the Transjordan tribes inherited. They had already been given to these tribes, but chapter 13 shows that what God had promised, he would deliver. Also, the setting aside of the cities of refuge and the Levitical cities fulfilled God's instructions in the Pentateuch concerning these. Furthermore, the individual inheritances of Caleb and the daughters of Zelophehad fulfilled specific promises to each of them. In addition, the statements about the people and the land having rest fulfilled promises about this also. Likewise, none of Israel's enemies was able to withstand them, just as God had promised. In summary, chapter 21 and verse 45 says, "Not one of all the Lord's good promises to the house of Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled." Now, the list in these chapters also emphasize the unity of the nation. Every tribe, no matter how large or small, received its duly appointed portion, and each portion is described in some detail. Every tribe was considered part of the nation, even Levi, so no tribe could claim to have been left out. Indeed, in the case of Levi, the fact that each tribe contributed roughly 4 cities apiece shows the nation coming together in a gesture of national unity as well. The careful tracing of almost every boundary line and the detailed listings of city after city in the various tribal territories show the importance of land inheritance and ownership. The way in which the boundary lines move from one geographic feature to another shows an intimate knowledge of the land and a love for it. Further, evidence of this care is that several joint boundaries, such as Judah's and Benjamin's, or Benjamin's and Ephraim's, are described in 2 places, and the descriptions match so closely. The detail and care employed in these chapters shows that all of the tribes, indeed even individuals, were important in God's estimation. None was too small or insignificant to be included. The attention to the individual inheritances of Caleb, the daughters of Zelophehad, and Joshua also shows this. At the same time, the list realistically show which were the most important tribes. Judah, the most important, is devoted the most space, and its boundary descriptions and city limits are the most detailed. Ephraim and Manasseh, the most important tribes of the north, also receive a significant amount of space. And Levi, the tribe of the priests and their helpers, also figures prominently. Now, concern for justice is also prominent in these chapters. This can be seen in the simple fact that every tribe received its due inheritance. It can also be seen in the distributions to individuals. The story of the daughters of Zelophehad and his inheritance shows this particularly well. Justice is also the major backdrop for the designation of cities of refuge, where those who had unintentionally killed another person could flee. It even is visible in the assignment of the Levitical cities, because this tribe was without any land otherwise. Now, the fact that God was the giver of the land is certainly a part of these chapters. He is specifically stated to have given Israel the land in chapter 18 and verse 3 and chapter 21 and verse 43. In addition, he controlled the lots that were cast for the division of the land. Furthermore, Joshua and Eleazar worked on his behalf in distributing the lands. Now, religious concerns also play a significant part in these chapters. Not only is Joshua, the nation's leader, involved in the land's distribution, but so too is Eleazar the high priest. His presence shows that there was a religious component to what was being done. Furthermore, the assembly in chapter 18, verses 1 through 10 at Shiloh, where the tent of meeting was, also shows that this was a religious exercise. The lots were cast there in God's presence, and the setting aside of Levitical cities shows the importance of God's special servants in charge of religious matters, as well as the specific notices about the meaning of the Levites' inheritance. Alongside the major themes of harmony, obedience, and completeness of the distributions, a minor note of disagreement is given in two ways. First, despite the thoroughness of the previous victories, much land remained to be taken. And second, several tribes failed to drive out the Canaanite inhabitants of lands or cities that they were assigned. These included Judah, Ephraim, Western Manasseh, and Dan. Thus, the seed was planted for much trouble in the years that followed. Now we come to chapters 22 through 24. These final three chapters all deal with farewells of sorts. Number one, Joshua said farewell to the Transjordan tribes, dismissing them to their inheritances east of the Jordan. Secondly, he said farewell to the entire nation in a speech urging them to follow the Lord. And thirdly, he again said farewell to the nation and led them in a covenant renewal ceremony at a different place and with different emphases. Even the final section of the book, where 3 short burial notices are found, is in effect the author's farewell to his readers, assuring them that everything had been completed faithfully and in order. Joshua's leadership role in the final 3 events is clear. In these 3 separate addresses, he blessed the people and urged them to follow the Lord, warned them of the consequences of disobedience, reviewed the Lord's faithfulness to them, and challenged them to follow him in reaffirming their covenant with their God. As a result, when Joshua is mentioned for the last time in the book, as we noticed earlier, the author bestows on him the coveted title, up to now held only by Moses, the title of the servant of the Lord. The question raised at the beginning of the book about Joshua's fitness to be Moses' successor is answered in a definitive way. He was worthy of the same title that attached to Moses. That is, both were servants of the Lord. All three chapters look forward to the future as well as backward to the past. After Joshua praised the tribes on the other side of the Jordan for their faithfulness, a misunderstanding arose concerning the tribes' relationship with each other, one that was important to resolve in order for future relationships to be clear. The focus of chapter 22 deals in large measure with the issue of the tribes' loyalties to each other and, more importantly, their loyalty to God. This harks back not only to the loyalties that Joshua urged at the beginning of the book, but it also anticipates the importance of loyalty in the years to come. Chapter 23 looks ahead to Israel's life in the land, stressing not only how God had fought for the nation and given it the land, but how it was now to live in the land. Chapter 24 focuses on the past to a much greater degree than chapter 23, but it also stresses Israel's obligations to its God and the covenant that bound it to him. We do not find any new initiatives on God's part in these chapters, undoubtedly because his promises were now all fulfilled. The focus now is on the loyalty of the people, their obedience, and their service to him. The lessons for us today from these chapters are found in the fact that we also, at different times, need to be encouraged, warned, and reminded concerning our lives before God. In Colossians chapter 2, Colossians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, it says, "For I want you to know how great a struggle I have on your behalf, and for those who are at Laodicea, and for all those who have not personally seen my face, that their hearts may be encouraged, having been knit together in love, and attaining to all the wealth that comes from the full assurance of understanding, resulting in a true knowledge of God's mystery, that is, Christ himself." And then in Luke chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, Jesus said, I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear the one who, after he has killed, has the authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. And then finally, in 2 Peter chapter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, it says, "This is now, beloved, the second letter I am writing to you, in which I am stirring up your sincere mind by way of reminder, that you should remember the words spoken beforehand by the holy prophets, and the commandment of the Lord and Savior spoken by your apostles." So again, the need even today for encouragement, warning, and reminding concerning what God has said, what he wants out of us, what he expects from us. It's constantly needed. And this is what at least part of the final chapters of Joshua is about. All right, this brings us then to the book of Judges. The first thing we need to notice is that the word judges is not so much a legal term as it is a word describing a person who delivers others. In this book, people did more fighting than they did judging, in the sense of deciding legal cases or some sort of things like that. They did a lot of delivering of the people. In fact, Judges 2 and verse 16 uses this word. In the New American Standard, it says, then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. Now, this period of time actually runs through 1 Samuel chapter 10. That is the book of Judges, or the period of the judges, the deliverers of the people, runs through 1 Samuel chapter 10, where Samuel is the last judge and Saul is installed as the first king. In Acts chapter 13 and verse 20, it says, after these things he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. The period of the judges lasts about 350 years. The book of Judges is the book of Judges is one of sharp contrast with the book of Joshua. It consists of a series of independent episodes, all joined by a common idea of Israel's apostasy. And God's faithfulness. The overall impression is one of near chaos in Israel's political and spiritual life, salvaged only by God's repeated intervention and provision. The book of Joshua had presented things as having gone well, and it ended on a peaceful note, with every family settling down on the land it had inherited. But Joshua, who early on was merely the aide of Moses, is now the servant of the Lord, and the land is now Israel's in fulfillment of the long string of promises from Abraham's day onward, and this fulfillment had been tied to Israel's obedience. But now, however, the statements in Joshua that the conquest had been incomplete and that Israel's obedience had been something less than total become full-blown realities in the book of Judges. We see that the warnings repeatedly sounded against foreign religious entanglements were well spoken, since Israel repeatedly turned away from the Lord to follow after the Canaanite gods. The period begins with Israel fighting the enemies it should have annihilated. It continues with Israel fighting various other foreign enemies as a result of its apostasy. And it concludes with Israelites fighting among themselves in the aftermath of a breach of covenant. The only positive notes in the book are God's constant faithfulness and the hints that things should get better under a new order. Now let's consider the title. English versions derive their title for the book from the Hebrew title Sophatim. This word usually is translated judges. It is the term given the 12 leaders of Israel during the period between Joshua and Samuel. The old Greek versions, the Septuagint, title it Kritai, which is, again, the Greek word for judges. And the Vulgate terms it Judicum, which is the Latin term for judges. Now, concerning the authorship and date of composition, like the book of Joshua, Judges is anonymous. We never have a statement within the book saying it was written by a certain person or recorded by a certain person. It is a collection of various blocks of material about different judges, but these blocks are not attributed to any particular source. Mainstream scholarship dates its final form in the 7th or 6th centuries BC, since it sees chapter 2 and verse 6 through chapter 16 and verse 31 as Deuteronomistic. That is, most of that material is related to what was said in Deuteronomy. Now, R.K. Harrison dates the book to the early monarchy in the 11th or 10th centuries BC. And certainly it was completed after the last events recorded in the book. The reference in chapter 18 and verse 30 to the day of the captivity of the land refers to the exile in the 6th century BC. This might suggest that at least an additional comment was added or some final editing was accomplished in the exile or afterwards. Otherwise, there are no clear indicators of its date of composition in the book or elsewhere in other materials. Now, let's talk about the unity of the book. The book is divided into several distinct sections. It begins with a prologue indicating that the conquest described in Joshua was incomplete. It then proceeds with an introduction that summarizes the cycle of events that recur over and over again in the book. Then the core of the book tells the stories of the individual judges. Finally, the book ends with two appendices that portray the period as almost completely debased. The material can be seen to have been brought together to form an intelligible, coherent final product with a clear purpose of the article. Now, the purpose and message of the book is to show that the problems contained in the book were not the fault of God. The reason that the Israelites did not have peace in the land was because of their disobedience in not driving out the inhabitants of the land. When they left the inhabitants of the land in place, the Israelites then turned to serve the gods of those people, and these actions caused the problems. This is summed up in Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt, and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. Now this is also brought out by the repetition of two phrases throughout the book. First, each cycle of evil and deliverance in chapters 3 through 16 is introduced by the observation that the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Second, in chapters 17 through 21, there is a phrase which serves to mark off this section by occurring at the beginning of it and at the end of it. The phrase is, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges chapter 17 and verse 6 and 21 verse 25. But the book also shows the mercy of God upon his people when they would repent and turn back to him. God would then send a deliverer, and as long as they obeyed God, they had peace in the land. Now, the book was also written to show the consequences of disobedience to God and to point the way to a king who, if he were righteous, would lead the people to God. In contrast to the serene way in which the book of Joshua ends, as a consequence of all Israel disobeying God's, in contrast to the serene way in which the book of Joshua ends, as a consequence of all Israel obeying God's commands for the most part, the book of Judges shows that in fact Israel began to disobey God even in the time of Joshua, and that this disobedience grew more serious and more debased throughout the period. Judges chapter 2, verses 16 through 23, points out the cyclical or repetitive nature of history during this period. However, the book makes clear that the repetitions were not merely of the same degree each time. Rather, each cycle took Israel further downward in its relationship with God and in its own religious malpractice. By the end of the book, it is clear that Israel has violated its covenant with God in almost every way imaginable. As a parallel to Israel's apostasy, God emerges as the true hero in the book. There is a certain irony in this, since the book focuses on a succession of heroes who delivered Israel. It was God who raised up the various heroic judges to deliver Israel from its crises, and it was He who remained faithful to the covenant. Israel failed because it did what was right in its own eyes, rather than what was right in the eyes of God. Now, the book of Judges is part of what is called the former prophets in the Hebrew canon. This is the case, at least in part, because Samuel, the last judge, was also a prophet, the first in a long line of prophets. The book logically and chronologically follows after the book of Joshua, developing themes from that book and showing the contrast with the idealized picture presented there. It naturally points ahead to the books of Samuel, which follow it in the Hebrew canon, in which the monarchy was established and began to flourish. The events of the book of Ruth, which follows it in the Christian canon, took place during the period of the Judges. Now, let's talk about the historical and cultural context for the book of Judges. Specifically, let's begin with the date of the events. The book of Judges covers a lengthy period, about 350 years, as we said before. The period begins with after the death of Joshua, sometime in the early 14th century BC, and it ends prior to the rise of Samuel to prominence and the coronation of Saul, which would be around 1050 BC or shortly thereafter. The book has numerous references to lengths of time, mostly to periods when Israel was opposed. Let's start over. The book has numerous references to the lengths of time, mostly to periods when Israel was oppressed or to periods of rest between the oppressions. If these are added up, the total for the period comes to at least 410 years. Now, added to the known lengths of Eli's, Samuel's, Saul's, and part of David's tenure as leaders, at least 100 years, plus the time in the wilderness and the conquest at least 40 years, we have a period of at least 550 years between the Exodus and the time that Solomon took office in 970 BC. That is in clear conflict with the statement in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 about there being 480 years between the Exodus and the laying of the foundation of the temple in Solomon's year. The generally agreed upon solution sees many of the episodes in Judges as happening concurrently in different parts of the land. For example, in chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, Eglon, king of Moab, along with the Ammonites and Amalekites, oppressed Israel, but they only took possession of the city of palms, according to 2 Chronicles 28:15. Ehud's actions in chapter 3, verses 15 through 30, may have been localized in the territory of Ephraim and Benjamin. Gideon's encounter with the Midianites was with the help only of Manasseh, his own tribe, and Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and later Ephraim. Thus, we cannot simply add up the numbers to arrive at the length of the period. Toward the end of the period, dating becomes somewhat easier, assuming the accuracy of Jephthah's statement about the 300-year period in 1126. That is chapter 11 and verse 26, and the early dating of the Exodus. Now, given an Exodus date of 1446 BC, which is what I believe, and a defeat of Sihon at 1406 BC, then Jephthah's statement would have come around 1106 BC, 18 years after the Ammonite and Philistine oppressions began. The Philistine oppression lasted 40 years until it was finally broken by Samuel at Mizpah. Samson's exploits would have overlapped Samuel's somewhat. His death likely came toward the end of the period of Philistine oppression. Now let's consider the historical setting of the events. This approximate 350-year period of the Judges spanned a major transition in the ancient Near East, when the late Bronze Age gave way to the early Iron Age shortly after 1200 BC. The late Bronze Age, which would have been from about 1550 to 1200 BC, was a period of prosperity. In Palestine, the system of relatively small independent city-states gave way to one of large empires, such as the Egyptians and the Hittites. Israelites and Canaanites were able to live there relatively undisturbed. At the end of the late Bronze Age, a major discontinuity appears in the archaeological record, somewhere around 1200 BC and shortly thereafter. This signaled the beginning of the Iron Age. Widespread destructions are evident all across the Mediterranean basin. In Canaan, the evidence shows a radical drop in population in the major population centers, and an increase in one-period sites in outlying areas. In the hill country and desert fringe areas, imported pottery abruptly ceases to show up. Local Philistine pottery is distinctive and rougher than pottery made in Cyprus that was imported. And there was also the especially beautiful Mycenaean pottery, so prevalent in Canaan and throughout the Mediterranean basin, that began the norm or that had been the norm in late Bronze Age. Now, the large visible signs of society vanished in the archaeological record. Empires, extensive international trade, dense population centers, fine crafts, and trades all disappeared. However, there was a continuity of culture at the grassroots level. Rough as it was, pottery did continue to be made. The same type of dislocation that occurred at the early Bronze Age to the Middle Bronze Age transition, the depopulation of urban centers with the rise of one-period sites in the hills and the desert fringes. This also can be seen at the late Bronze Age, Iron Age transition. The causes of these widespread destructions are not clearly known, but they coincide with the migrations of the land and sea peoples known from Egyptian texts. These people clashed with Egypt at the end of the 13th century BC, and they are seen involved in other disturbances in the eastern Mediterranean as well. Therefore, the early Iron Age, from 1200 to 1000 BC, was a dark age of sorts. The judgment made above about most of the biblical judges' activities being localized in relatively small geographical areas easily accords with the picture that we are giving here. It was not until about 1000 BC that a true internationalism reasserted itself throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and houses and cities began to rival those of the late Bronze Age again. There were two technological advances worthy of note in the early Iron Age. The first was the development of iron tools and weapons. This allowed for more sophisticated agricultural and military techniques. The second was the development of plastered cisterns for water storage. These are seen for the first time in the period of Iron 1 all over Palestine. They freed settlements from being completely dependent on wells, springs, or bodies of water. Now, for the first time, Philistines appear as a major identifiable grouping on the southwest coast of Canaan. They settled in, manufacturing their own crude but distinctive pottery, carrying on a limited sea-based trade, and eventually achieving a monopoly in the use of iron weapons, which they used to their advantage against Israel. During the Judges period, Samson was the major Israelite foe of the Philistines. Later, Samuel, Saul, and David led Israel against them, and it was David who finally broke their hold on Israel. The Israelites eventually did gain access to iron weapons, according to 1 Samuel 13:21. It's interesting to note that by the 10th century BC, the technological tide seems to have turned. Samuel, Saul, and David were successful in subduing the Philistines. Archaeologically, this picture is illustrated dramatically. Blacksmiths from northern Palestine were producing what is called carburized iron or steel, while Philistines show no corresponding technological advances. While Philistine sites show no corresponding technological advances. This corresponds with the biblical picture in which, by this time, a political structure was in place capable of supporting such specialized technology, that is, the monarchy. The Bible pictures the Philistines as a coarse people who were uncircumcised. Their major god was Dagon, known from Mesopotamian and Syrian sources as Dagan. The Philistines were organized into a federation under 5 lords, chiefs of their 5 major cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. A distinctive type of pottery known simply as Philistine pottery, has been unearthed at Philistine sites, beginning shortly after 1200 BC, which imitates rather poorly the Mycenaean pottery of the Late Bronze Age. No true Philistine writings or text have been discovered at this point in time. Now let's talk about Canaanite religion and culture. The major problem for Israel during the period of the Judges was the fact that they turned away from the Lord and toward the gods of the Canaanites. What was it about Canaanite religion and culture that proved to be such an irresistible attraction? Well, first, the land of Canaan was awe-inspiring to the Israelites, as evidenced in the story of the spies who came back with a report on its wealth and strength back in Numbers chapter 13. We already have noted the large cities with their wealth and development. To a recently freed slave people accustomed to the hardships of life in Egypt as slaves and in the wilderness, this was very impressive. The Canaanites were clearly superior to the Israelites on many levels, at least culturally, like in art, literature, architecture, trade, political organization, and more. It's not difficult at all to see how the Israelites would have been tempted by the elaborate Canaanite religious system, which ostensibly supported or even provided all of this wealth and great things, at least in the eyes of the Canaanites. Now, the religion of Canaan posed the greatest threat to Israel during this period. Indeed, we see pictures of it throughout the Bible. In the book of Judges, Israel repeatedly follows after Canaanite gods, such as Baal and Ashtaroth. There were also other gods. Next, the first concern of any primitive culture was food. Thus, ideas concerning fertility were central in almost every culture. And Canaanite religion was no different. Because of this, it had a drawing power because of its association with agricultural fertility. That is, when we talk about like Baal is the god of the storm, the weather, okay, but he's also the god of fertility. That doesn't have to do with fertility, or at least not exclusively with fertility in human procreation, but more with agricultural fertility. That is, the greater fertility of your crops and the greater amount of rain and sunshine and all this stuff would bring you greater amount of harvest. So they would look to Baal for, at least the Canaanites looked to Baal for their harvest. Now, an additional attraction undoubtedly was in the system of, in Baal worship and others, of sacred prostitutes, priestesses of Baal. A follower of Baal could go into a priestess and, by means of sexual intimacy with Baal's representative in a human fertility rite, this was supposed to persuade Baal to grant fertility to the fields of the worshiper. Now, this mixture of sex with religion undoubtedly was a positive factor in many Israelite minds. If you go back and look into the book of Numbers, you will notice the account of the Israelites and the Moabite women in Numbers chapter 25. Now, another of the Canaanites' attractions was the wealth evident among them. The Canaanite cities of the late Bronze Age were vastly superior to Israelite towns in the hill country. The lure of materialism was as powerful then as it is today. I want to finish, I know it's come to the end of our session. The time has ended, but I want to finish this discussion, which should take us, I hope, not too much longer, and then we'll quit. Another attraction that the Israelites might have seen to Canaanite culture and religion is what we will call the Canaanite pantheon. That is, the Canaanite system included numerous gods, 5 of which were most prominent. There was El, Asherah, Baal, Astarte, and Anath. El was the head of the Canaanite pantheon. He was the father of the gods and of mortals. Although the head of the gods, he appears as relatively weak and enfeebled, at least when compared to Baal. Asherah was El's wife, the mother of the gods, goddess of the sea. She appears in the Bible in 1 Kings 15 and 1 Kings 18 and other passages. And the wooden Asherah poles associated with her worship are also in evidence. Deuteronomy 16, 2 Kings 23, and other passages, and here in Judges chapter 6 specifically. Asherah appears in a striking example from a later period in a drawing and inscription found at a location in southern Israel. A bull and a cow are pictured with the inscription "For Yahweh and his Asherah," suggesting that some of those worshiping there felt that God needed a wife, just as the false god El had one. Now, Baal was the storm god. He ended up as the most powerful god in the pantheon, probably because of his connections with fertility. The storm represents power, but it also gives life-giving rain that makes the land fertile, as we've already said. In the Baal cycle of text from Ugarit, he is shown dying and rising in keeping with his role as fertility god, reflecting the annual cycle of the seasons. He is mentioned often in the Bible, and the climax of his influence in Israel came under the permissive reign of Ahab in 1 Kings 16 through chapter 22. Next, there is Astarte, or Ashtoreth. She was a female fertility goddess and a goddess of love and war, closely associated with Baal. She also appears to have had some connections to the stars and planets. She is not mentioned very often in the Ugaritic text, but corresponds to Ishtar in Mesopotamian texts, and she appears in Egyptian representations of Canaanite religion. The Ashtaroth, or the Ashtoreths, are mentioned in the Bible along with the Baals, Judges 10, 1 Samuel 7, and 1 Samuel 12. Finally, there is Anath. She was Baal's sister and wife. She was also a goddess of love and war. She often appears in winged form. In the Baal cycle, she appears as rather bloodthirsty. She does not appear in the Bible except perhaps in connection with Shamgar's name. Shamgar's father was named Anath, Judges chapter 3 and verse 31. All right, we'll stop there, and when we come back in session 6, we'll pick up with some special issues in the book of Judges. And as always, feel free to call on me if you have any questions. Thank you.